The Baronet's Housekeeper. Chapter 1. A name that no longer opened doors. Ridley House had been built to be looked at, not with the gawking admiration reserved for novelty, but with the steady regard given to things assumed permanent. Old stone warmed by centuries of fortune, windows set in strict symmetry, a facade designed to suggest not extravagance but certainty. It sat above the village like a thought too important to descend among common streets. There were fields beyond it, tenants' cottages, hedgerows cut with practiced hands, visible signs of a family that had long commanded more than land. Yet even at a distance one could sense the house's altered character. It was not empty. It was simply withdrawn. The drive was swept but seldom disturbed. The gates were kept, but rarely opened for visitors. The gardens were trimmed only so far as neglect might become public. Ridley House, in short, endured, but it did not welcome. Miss Margaret Linton arrived on an April afternoon under a sky that threatened rain without quite delivering it. The hired chaise set her down at the foot of the steps, and she descended without waiting for assistance, careful not to look as though she expected it. She had once been a girl for whom doors were opened in anticipation. Now she was a woman who measured every expression, every pause, every breath. If she had learned anything in the last 5 years, it was that dignity could be stolen from a person by others and preserved only by one's own discipline. Margaret was 28. Her gown was plain but well cut, the fabric good wool rather than silk, her bonnet modest, her gloves mended with such careful neatness they might have been new. She carried a small carpet bag in one hand, and in the other a parcel of papers, references, certificates, the thin armour with which a respectable woman attempted to defend herself from suspicion. She paused a moment, not to admire the house, but to steady her mind. Ridley House was large enough to swallow her whole. She knew what it was to be swallowed by a story. The front door opened. A footman of middling years stood there, correct and reserved. "Miss Linton," he said, not as a question, "if you will follow me." The entrance hall was cool, shadowed and oddly spare for a house of such standing. There was a fine rug, but worn. There were portraits, but fewer than expected. There were no fresh flowers, no scent of recent company. Everything felt maintained rather than lived in. The footman led her to a smaller sitting room on the ground floor, where a woman rose from her chair with a stiffness earned by long service. "I am Mrs. Elwood," the woman said, her tone brisk. Her cap was starched, her posture rigid, her eyes sharp. "You are Miss Margaret Linton." Margaret dipped a proper curtsy. "I am. Thank you for receiving me." Mrs. Elwood's gaze travelled over her in an instant, taking in not only dress and manner, but the indefinable marks of breeding that could not be fully disguised. "You have been recommended," Mrs. Elwood said. "That is no small matter here." "I am grateful," Margaret replied. "You understand the position, I trust?" "Yes." "This is not a house that entertains," Mrs. Elwood continued. "We have little traffic. Sir Thomas prefers it so. He does not conduct interviews. He approved your appointment on paper. You will see him only rarely." Margaret's reply came easily, because it was true. "That will suit me." Mrs. Elwood's eyes narrowed slightly. Most women seeking employment in a gentleman's household had some mixture of eagerness and fear, eagerness for security, fear of displeasing. Miss Linton displayed neither. She sat with composed stillness, hands folded, spine straight, as though she had known drawing rooms before and did not intend to forget it. "And your background," Mrs. Elwood said more quietly. Margaret had rehearsed many versions of the truth. There was the version that disguised and dodged. There was the version that blamed others. There was the version that pleaded. None of those had saved her. So she offered the truth, pared down to what could be borne. "My father was a clergyman," she said. "I was educated accordingly. After his death, my circumstances changed. I have worked in 2 households since." "And why did you leave them?" Mrs. Elwood asked, watching carefully. "One no longer required my position," Margaret said evenly, "and in the other, I was not a comfortable fit." Mrs. Elwood held her gaze. "That is vague." Margaret's mouth tightened, not in defiance but in a controlled restraint. "Because my name is not liked," she said quietly. The words fell into the room with the weight of a stone dropped into deep water. Mrs. Elwood did not look away. "No one comes to service with a name that is liked," she said at last, not unkindly. "Not unless they are widows with a pension." Margaret allowed herself the faintest breath of relief. "I am not a widow," she said. "No," Mrs. Elwood replied, and there was something in her tone, something like understanding sharpened by age. "I can see that." There was a pause, then Mrs. Elwood rose. "You will have a trial month," she said. "Your authority below stairs will be supported. If you fail, you will be sent away. If you succeed, you will remain so long as you cause no disturbance." "I cause none," Margaret said simply. "I have learned the cost." Mrs. Elwood's eyes rested on her a moment longer, and then she nodded once, as though some internal decision had been made. "You may be shown to your room." Margaret followed the maid upstairs to a modest chamber overlooking the eastern garden. It was plain but clean, its window admitting soft light. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small desk. The sort of room meant for usefulness rather than comfort. When she was alone, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap. In that stillness, her memories pressed closer, as they always did at the edge of new beginnings. She saw again the assembly room in Bath, bright with candlelight, her own laughter too free. She heard again the voice of Mr. Julian Harroway, handsome, persuasive, a man with a smile that seemed to promise safety. She felt again the shiver of shock when the letter arrived from London. Not an engagement, but an accusation. And then the second letter, and the third, and then nothing. Nothing but whispers that travelled faster than truth. Margaret closed her eyes. It had not been an elopement. It had not been an affair. It had not even been a kiss. It had been a private meeting. She had been foolish enough to believe that privacy was allowed to women. Julian Harroway had persuaded her to meet him in the conservatory of a friend's house after a musicale. He spoke of intentions, of honour, of urgency. He pressed her hand. She permitted it. He asked for a vow of secrecy, as though secrecy were romance. And then, whether by his design or by a misfortune he took advantage of, someone saw. A footman, perhaps, a maid, a cousin hungry for gossip. It did not matter. Within 2 days, the story was not that she had met him. The story was that she had been compromised. Within a week, the story was that she had tried to trap him. Within a fortnight, Julian Harroway was engaged to another woman, richer, better connected, and Margaret Linton's prospects were finished. Worse than finished, stained. A young woman could survive poverty, she could survive plainness, she could survive a lack of dowry, but she could not survive a suggestion that she had been willing to bargain her virtue. Margaret rose, went to the washstand, and splashed water on her face. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury. They advertised pain to people who might use it. Instead, she smoothed her hair, unpacked her modest belongings, and prepared herself for the work that would keep her safe. Ridley House, she told herself, did not care about society's stories, and she would make sure society never entered its doors. Sir Thomas Ridley watched her arrival from the library window. He had not meant to, he told himself that at least. Yet he had been drawn to the window, as though compelled, as he always was when anything changed in the house. Change had become dangerous to him. It meant intrusion. It meant the possibility of voices where there had been none. From the shadowed room he saw her step down from the chaise. He saw the pause at the foot of the steps, the slight lift of her chin, the composure with which she faced the house. No hesitation, no anxious smile, no attempt to charm. That was unexpected. Most women who came to Ridley House came because they were desperate. Desperation had a smell. It made people ingratiating, demanding, resentful, grasping. This woman looked contained. He turned away, his injured leg flaring with familiar pain as he shifted his weight. He leaned harder on his cane than he liked. 6 years ago, he had been a man whose name opened doors without effort. Now he was a man whose name opened letters full of pity, curiosity, or moral instruction. He had retreated from London after the scandal, not the scandal of his injury, but the other one. The one that followed him like a shadow no distance could fully remove. He had thought solitude would preserve what remained of his honour. Instead, it had only preserved his loneliness. A housekeeper was needed, Mrs. Elwood had insisted, and Sir Thomas had agreed because he was tired. But as he watched Miss Linton disappear into the house, he felt a faint, unwelcome tightening in his chest. A woman like that was not meant to be invisible. And at Ridley House, invisibility was the only protection anyone had. Chapter 2. Order below stairs, silence above. Margaret established herself with a steadiness that was almost unsettling. She did not arrive like a storm, overturning habits for the sake of proving authority. Nor did she arrive like a mouse, timid and apologetic. She observed first. She listened. She learned the tensions of the household, old resentments, quiet alliances, the particular ways servants protected themselves when their master withdrew. There were not many servants left. Cook, a scullery maid, 2 housemaids, the footman, a young lad who ran messages, and Mrs. Elwood herself, who had done too much for too long. The stable staff were kept separate, overseen by the steward. The house, for its size, was underpopulated. That created a peculiar intimacy, every movement noticed, every change magnified. Margaret became within days the centre of that attention. Cook watched her for signs of arrogance. The housemaids watched for weakness. The footman watched for power he might resist. Mrs. Elwood watched for failure. Margaret gave them none of what they expected. She reviewed accounts with care and complimented Cook's ability to stretch supplies without sacrificing quality. She altered schedules to lessen strain on the scullery maid's hands. She corrected the footman's tendency to idle, not with scolding, but by giving him responsibilities that appealed to his pride. She spoke rarely of herself. That, more than anything, unsettled them. People trusted gossip more than silence. Within a fortnight, the house ran more smoothly than it had in years. And yet the servants were not entirely reassured. They whispered anyway. It began with small observations. Miss Linton's accent was too refined for her position. Miss Linton read in the evenings, not penny pamphlets, but books from the library. Miss Linton wrote letters with a steady hand, sealing them with wax as though used to correspondence. "She's gentle," whispered one maid to another. "She's fallen," whispered the other, because fallen explained what gentle could not. Mrs. Elwood heard the murmurs and shut them down where she could, but whispers were like damp. They crept into cracks no one could fully seal. Margaret did not pretend not to notice. She simply refused to respond. She had learned, painfully, that explanation rarely cleared a stain. It only drew attention to it. It was nearly a month before she encountered Sir Thomas Ridley in person. The meeting was accidental, but the effect was not. Margaret had gone to inspect a draft troubling the west corridor. It was the kind of task she preferred, practical, unobtrusive, safe. She had nearly reached the window when the library door opened behind her. Sir Thomas stepped out and stopped abruptly when he saw her. For a moment, neither moved. He was taller than she had expected, though the cane and careful set of his weight suggested fragility. His hair was darker than fashionable, his face drawn by pain and solitude, and his eyes, grey, intelligent, were the eyes of a man who observed more than he spoke. Margaret curtsied properly. "Sir Thomas." He inclined his head as though the motion cost him. "You are Miss Linton," he said. "I am." A pause. The corridor seemed too narrow, too quiet, as if the house itself listened. "I was told the household has improved," he said at last, the words stiff with formality. "I am pleased," Margaret replied. "The staff has been most capable." He studied her. It was not a leering or assessing look, but the careful scrutiny of a man who had been betrayed by appearances before. "You have been in service long?" he asked. "No," Margaret said. He waited, perhaps expecting elaboration. When none came, his mouth tightened slightly, not in displeasure but surprise. "And you find Ridley House acceptable?" "I find it orderly," she answered, choosing her words with care. "And quiet." "Quiet," he echoed, as though tasting the word. Margaret lifted her eyes to his, meeting them without flinching. "Quiet is valuable," she said. Something in his expression shifted, something like recognition. He gave a short nod. "I will not detain you," he said, stepping aside. "As you wish, Sir Thomas." She moved past him without hurry, her pulse steady until she reached the turn of the corridor. Only then did she exhale. It had been nothing, polite words, proper distance, and yet she had felt in those few moments the invisible weight of a life pressed shut against the world. She recognized that weight. After that encounter, their paths crossed more often, not by plan at first, but by the simple fact that Ridley House was quiet enough for any movement to become significant. Sir Thomas began to appear at odd hours, the library, the garden walk on fine days, the hall near dusk. Sometimes he asked practical questions about the household. Sometimes he said nothing, merely acknowledging her presence with a small nod, then continuing on. Margaret did not chase conversation. She answered when addressed and withdrew when dismissed. She had no intention of becoming a subject of interest in a house that already suspected her. Yet something about Sir Thomas drew her attention against her will, not his title, which meant little to her now, but his restraint. He spoke as though words were costly. His gaze held a guardedness she understood. One evening, Mrs. Elwood entered the still room where Margaret was checking stores. "He asked after the preserves," Mrs. Elwood said with the faintest disbelief. "Sir Thomas asked me directly." Margaret looked up. "That is unusual." "He asked after nothing for years," Mrs. Elwood replied. "Not unless something was wrong." Margaret's fingers tightened briefly around her pencil. "Then perhaps he is not as content with withdrawal as he seems," she said softly. Mrs. Elwood regarded her with sharp eyes. "Do not imagine you can change him," she warned. Margaret's face remained composed. "I do not imagine," she replied. "I only observe." But later, alone, she thought of his gaze in the corridor, and she wondered what he had seen in her that he recognized. Chapter 3. The house begins to talk. The change began with an accident. Sir Thomas fell in the garden on a pale, windless afternoon. It was not a dramatic tumble, not the kind that would draw attention from the village. It was a quiet misstep on loose gravel, the kind that might be dismissed if it happened to any other man. But Sir Thomas's injury made balance treacherous. Once he was down, pride fought pain, and lost. A stable boy spotted him and ran to the house. By the time Margaret reached the garden, Sir Thomas was seated rigidly on a stone bench, his cane on the ground, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles stood out. He looked up as she approached, and irritation flashed across his face. "This is unnecessary," he said sharply. Margaret stopped a respectful distance away. "You are in pain," she replied. "I require no audience." "You require discretion," Margaret said quietly, "and I can offer it." Something in her tone, calm, unafraid, stilled his protest. She gave instructions to the boy in a low voice, sending him for the footman and for a chair. When they arrived, she directed them efficiently, her manner leaving no room for argument. Sir Thomas watched her as she moved, the steadiness of her competence cutting through his humiliation. When he was safely indoors, Margaret dismissed the servants with a firmness that surprised even herself. In the quiet that followed, Sir Thomas sat heavily, his face pale. "You presume," he said, though without conviction. "I manage this house," Margaret replied. "I presume only what my duties require." He exhaled, a sound that was almost a laugh without amusement. "You were not raised for this." Margaret's eyes met his, and something old and guarded moved in her expression. "No," she said. "But I was raised to endure worse." The words hung between them. Sir Thomas's gaze sharpened. "Worse than this." Margaret did not answer directly. "Pain is not always in the body," she said softly. For the first time, Sir Thomas looked at her as if she were not merely a capable servant. He looked at her as if she were a person. After that day, he spoke to her more. At first, it was practical. Questions about household expenses, tenant complaints, repairs needed. But soon the topics drifted into unexpected corners. Books, the weather, a passage of poetry half remembered, a conversation about whether silence protected a person or simply isolated them. Margaret found herself, against caution, responding with more than mere politeness. Sir Thomas had a mind that had not dulled with solitude. He asked questions that required thought, not flattery. When he disagreed, he did so without cruelty. When he listened, he did so fully. It was dangerous. Not because he behaved improperly. He did not. Not because he pressed himself upon her. He never did. But because he made her feel seen in a way she had not been seen since before her disgrace. And being seen had once destroyed her. The servants noticed the change at once. It began with the footman's narrowed eyes when Sir Thomas paused to speak with Miss Linton in the hall. It continued with cook's sharp curiosity when tea was ordered in the library twice in 1 week. It grew with the housemaid's whispers that Miss Linton walked too confidently, that she looked too composed, that she belonged too easily in rooms servants did not belong in. Mrs. Elwood confronted Margaret one evening after supper. "They talk," she said bluntly. Margaret's hands stilled on the accounts. "I know." "They say he favours you." Margaret's expression remained calm. "He favours competence," she replied. "That is all." Mrs. Elwood's gaze was hard. "Do not be naive. Men do not break habits for competence alone." Margaret felt a familiar coldness move through her chest. "I am not naive," she said quietly. "I am cautious." "Then be more cautious," Mrs. Elwood snapped. "This house cannot bear another scandal." Margaret's head lifted slightly. "Another," she repeated very softly. Mrs. Elwood's mouth tightened. She said nothing more, but the silence itself was an answer. That night, Margaret lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Another scandal. She had heard whispers in the village before accepting the post. Sir Thomas Ridley was reclusive, wounded, bitter. Some said he was mad with guilt. Some said he had ruined a woman. Some said he had killed a man. Stories grew in the absence of truth. Margaret understood that too well. One rainy evening, Sir Thomas sat in the library with a glass of wine untouched, his gaze fixed on the fire. Margaret had brought him tea. She would have left at once, but he spoke before she could retreat. "Do you know why I withdrew?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret froze, not outwardly but inwardly. Questions like that were traps, even when asked sincerely. "I have heard rumours," she said carefully. He gave a short, humourless laugh. "Of course you have." Margaret did not speak. After a long pause, Sir Thomas said, "There was a woman." Margaret's pulse quickened, but her face remained composed. "She was not," he began, then stopped, as though choosing language. "She was connected to this house." "A relation?" Margaret asked softly. "My ward," Sir Thomas said, the words tight. Margaret's throat tightened. A ward, a young woman under a man's protection, the very arrangement society used to produce both safety and scandal. "She was young," he continued, staring at the fire. "She was lively, clever. She thought the world owed her pleasure." Margaret did not interrupt. She sensed that if she did, he might stop entirely. "My cousin, Edmund, was often here," Sir Thomas went on. "He was charming, as men like him always are. My ward adored him. She believed he would marry her." Margaret's hands were cold around the tray she held. "He did not," Sir Thomas said. "He never intended it." Margaret understood. She had met Edmund Ridley's type, though under a different name. "There was an argument," Sir Thomas continued. "A confrontation. She was in tears. And Edmund—" He swallowed. "I demanded he leave. He refused. He laughed." Sir Thomas's jaw clenched. "I struck him," he said simply. Margaret's breath caught. "In the hall," he added. "In this very house." She waited. "He challenged me to a duel the next morning," Sir Thomas said. "I accepted." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "And—" Sir Thomas's eyes remained on the fire. "I shot him," he said. "Not to kill. But the shot went where it went." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. A duel. A death. A baronet's name stained with blood. "He died within the hour," Sir Thomas said, his voice flat. "His family, they wanted a villain. They found one." Margaret held still. "And your ward?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Sir Thomas's face tightened. "She vanished," he said. "She left a note. She said she would not live under the weight of shame. She said she was sorry." Margaret's throat constricted. She could almost see the girl's handwriting, desperate and ashamed. "She was found 2 days later," Sir Thomas said, the words slow, controlled. "In the river." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush. Margaret stood very still, her mind racing with the implications. A young woman dead, a duel, a baronet blamed, a household that had never recovered. No wonder Ridley House shut itself away. "You think it was your fault?" Margaret said quietly. Sir Thomas looked up, his eyes raw for the first time. "It was," he said. "If I had seen what Edmund was sooner, if I had protected her properly, if I had prevented—" "No," Margaret said, more firmly than she intended. "Your cousin is at fault for his cruelty. The world is at fault for its mercilessness. And you—" She stopped, catching herself. Sir Thomas watched her, as though he had never been contradicted with kindness before. Margaret lowered her gaze. "I should not speak so freely," she said. Sir Thomas's voice softened, almost unwillingly. "No," he said. "You should." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray. She stepped back, ready to retreat, to restore distance. But Sir Thomas spoke again, quiet as the rain against the glass. "And you?" he asked. "What did the world accuse you of?" Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. For a moment she could not breathe. Then she said very softly, "Of being willing." Sir Thomas's brow furrowed. "Willing?" "To bargain myself," Margaret said, "to entrap a man into marriage, to behave without honour." Sir Thomas's expression darkened. "Were you?" Margaret looked at him, and the old humiliation rose like bile. "No," she said, her voice steady only by force. "I was foolish, and I was alone with him, briefly. That was enough." Sir Thomas's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. "A man who cared for honour would have married you," he said, anger entering his voice. Margaret's mouth tightened in something like bitter amusement. He married a woman with £20,000. Sir Thomas stared at her, as if he could not decide whether to speak or remain silent. Then he said, slowly, "You were punished for trusting." Margaret's eyes stung, not with tears, but with the old sharp ache of being understood. "Yes," she whispered, "and I learned not to trust again." Something in Sir Thomas's gaze changed. It was not desire. Not yet. It was something slower, heavier. Recognition. And perhaps in that recognition, the first true danger began. Chapter 4. Society finds the door ajar. Rumour rarely needed proof. It needed only a gap. The gap came in the form of Lady Ridley, Sir Thomas's aunt, who arrived unannounced on a bright May morning, her carriage rolling up the drive like an invasion. The servants panicked. Mrs. Elwood went pale. Sir Thomas, when informed, went very still. Margaret stood in the doorway of the hall, hearing the commotion, and felt an old dread rise. Society was not supposed to reach Ridley House, but society, it seemed, had found the address. Lady Ridley swept into the hall with the confidence of a woman who believed herself entitled to any space she entered. She was elegant, severe, and not unkind by nature, only convinced that kindness must always be guided by principle. "Thomas," she said, her voice sharp with relief and disapproval. "I could not bear it any longer." Sir Thomas appeared, leaning on his cane. "Aunt," he said, his tone controlled, "you should have written." "I did," she replied briskly. "You did not answer." Sir Thomas did not deny it. Lady Ridley's gaze moved over the hall, the servants, the subdued atmosphere. She frowned. "This place feels like a mausoleum," she said. "You cannot live like this." Sir Thomas's expression tightened. "I live," he said. "That is enough." "It is not," she snapped. Then catching herself, she exhaled and softened slightly. "Forgive me. I did not come to quarrel. I came to help." Sir Thomas's mouth tightened with irony. "You cannot help what is past." Lady Ridley's eyes sharpened. "No," she said, "but I can help what is becoming your future." Her gaze shifted and landed on Margaret. Margaret had not moved. She stood perfectly still, posture straight, hands clasped before her, the picture of respectful distance. Lady Ridley's eyes narrowed. "And who," she asked, "is this?" Sir Thomas hesitated. Margaret felt it in her bones, the faint pause that meant danger. Then Sir Thomas said, "My housekeeper, Miss Linton." Lady Ridley's gaze lingered, assessing. Miss Linton's accent was too refined, her face too composed, her manner too controlled. "Is that so?" Lady Ridley said slowly. "She is unusual." Margaret curtsied. "My lady." Lady Ridley's eyes flickered, and for a moment Margaret saw something like recognition. A woman of the ton remembered names, not always kindly. Lady Ridley said nothing more in that moment, but Margaret felt the chill move through her. The household endured Lady Ridley's stay like a siege. She rearranged routines, criticised the sparsity of meals, questioned the staff, demanded to know why Sir Thomas refused visitors. She pressed him to return to London. She spoke of duty, lineage, and restoration. Sir Thomas resisted, but his resistance was weary rather than fierce. He had been fighting the world too long to have fresh strength for it, and Lady Ridley, whether by intention or instinct, watched Margaret. She watched how Sir Thomas addressed her, how his voice softened by half a tone when he spoke to her, how he paused, briefly, barely noticeably, when Margaret entered a room. It was not, strictly speaking, improper. But Lady Ridley had lived long enough to see how impropriety began. One afternoon she summoned Margaret to the morning room. Margaret went at once, heart steady, face composed. Lady Ridley sat by the window, a letter in her hand. "Miss Linton," she said, "you were recommended to this house." "I was, my lady." "And you have served before?" "Yes." Lady Ridley tapped the letter. "You are, I believe, the daughter of the late Reverend Linton." "I am." Lady Ridley's eyes narrowed further. "And you were once in Bath?" Margaret's chest tightened. "Yes," she said quietly. Lady Ridley's voice became sharper. "You were connected to Mr. Julian Harroway." The room seemed to grow colder. Margaret held herself still, every muscle disciplined. "I was acquainted with him," she said. Lady Ridley's mouth tightened. "Acquainted," she repeated, as if tasting the word. A gentle term for what society claimed. Margaret's voice remained steady, though it cost her. Society claimed many things. Lady Ridley leaned forward slightly. "And what was the truth?" Margaret's eyes lifted. "The truth," she said softly, "is that I trusted a man who valued his convenience more than my honour." Lady Ridley stared at her. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw a flicker of sympathy. Then Lady Ridley's expression hardened again. "Sympathy does not alter consequences," she said. "You are here, Miss Linton, because this house is secluded, because my nephew is vulnerable, because you perhaps require concealment." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I require employment," she said, "nothing else." Lady Ridley's voice lowered. "You must understand," she said, "that Sir Thomas cannot endure another scandal." Margaret's throat tightened. "Another," she echoed, thinking of Mrs. Elwood's warning. Lady Ridley's eyes were sharp. "You do know, then," she said, "of Edmund, of the girl, of the duel." Margaret inclined her head carefully. "I know enough." "Then you understand," Lady Ridley said, "that any whisper, any suggestion, that Sir Thomas is involved in impropriety again will destroy what little chance he has to recover his standing." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "I have not behaved improperly." Lady Ridley's eyes flashed. "Impropriety is not always behaviour," she said. "It is perception." Margaret felt the old humiliation flare, how perception had ruined her without proof. She spoke before she could stop herself. "And what does a woman do?" she asked very softly, "when perception condemns her regardless?" Lady Ridley stared at her. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Lady Ridley said with an unexpected quietness, "She suffers." Margaret's breath caught. The admission was not kind, but it was honest. Lady Ridley rose. "You will keep your distance," she said. "Do you understand me?" Margaret curtsied. "I have always kept my distance," she said. "The world insists upon it." Lady Ridley looked at her a moment longer, then turned away. Margaret left the room with her pulse steady and her heart bruised. That evening, Sir Thomas found Margaret in the corridor outside the still-room, her hands full of linens. "Miss Linton," he said. She turned, composed. "My aunt spoke with you," he said, his voice tight. "Yes." "What did she say?" Margaret hesitated. Honesty was dangerous, yet half-truths were worse. "She reminded me," Margaret said carefully, "that perception rules more than reality." Sir Thomas's expression darkened. "She threatened you." "She warned me," Margaret corrected gently. "There is a difference." Sir Thomas's jaw tightened. "I will not have you treated as though you are—" He stopped, the words caught behind his teeth. "As though I am what society decided I am," Margaret finished quietly. Sir Thomas's gaze sharpened. "And what did society decide?" he asked, though he already knew. Margaret's mouth tightened. "That I am willing," she said again, very softly. Something in Sir Thomas's face broke. Anger, sorrow, frustration. "And you are not," he said, not a question, but a certainty. Margaret's eyes flickered up to his. "No," she said, "but certainty did not save me." Sir Thomas stepped closer, then stopped himself, as if a line had appeared between them he dared not cross. "I am tired," he said, voice low, "of the world deciding." Margaret felt her pulse shift, not with fear this time, but with something fragile and dangerous. "So am I," she whispered. Silence stretched. Then Sir Thomas said with effort, "This cannot continue." Margaret's stomach tightened. She had known this moment would come, one way or another. "I will go," she said at once, steady. "You need not dismiss me cruelly. I will go." Sir Thomas's eyes narrowed. "No," he said. "That is not what I meant." Margaret stared. Sir Thomas's voice was rougher than she had ever heard it. "I meant this closeness," he said. "This understanding." Margaret's throat constricted. "We have done nothing wrong," she said. "And yet," Sir Thomas replied bitterly, "the house talks, my aunt watches, society senses a story." Margaret looked down. "I will not be your ruin," she said. Sir Thomas's voice softened painfully. "You are not the danger," he said. "The danger is that I—" He stopped, swallowed, and began again. "The danger is that I find my life less empty when you are in it." Margaret's breath caught. The admission was simple and devastating. She forced herself to remain composed. "That is kind," she said carefully, "but it cannot matter." Sir Thomas's gaze fixed on her with a steadiness that felt like a hand on her chest. "It matters to me," he said quietly. Margaret's eyes stung, but she did not allow tears. "And if it matters," she whispered, "it will destroy you." Sir Thomas's expression tightened. "I have already been destroyed once," he said, "and I survived." Margaret's voice trembled despite her control. "So did I," she said, "but survival does not mean we can endure it twice." Sir Thomas stared at her, the muscles in his jaw working. Then he said very quietly, "Tell me what you would have me do." Margaret's voice came out as a whisper. "Let me leave," she said, "before the story grows teeth." Sir Thomas was silent, and in that silence, Margaret knew the world had already begun to close in. The next blow came swiftly, because gossip never moved slowly once it smelled blood. A letter arrived from London, an acquaintance of Lady Ridley's, mentioning, in polite phrases, that Sir Thomas's household had acquired a remarkably refined housekeeper with an interesting history. The words were velvet, the implication was steel. Lady Ridley confronted Sir Thomas at once. "You see," she snapped, "it begins already." Sir Thomas's face went pale. "You wrote," he accused. "I did not," Lady Ridley insisted, "but others watch, others remember, others delight in a fallen woman attached to a damaged man." Sir Thomas's hand tightened on his cane. "She is not attached to me." Lady Ridley's eyes were sharp. "Not in fact," she said. "In story." Sir Thomas's voice went low. "Then I will end the story." Lady Ridley exhaled, as if relief was forced through her. "You will dismiss her." Sir Thomas's eyes lifted, and something in them hardened. "No," he said. Lady Ridley froze. "What did you say?" Sir Thomas's voice was steady. "I said no." Lady Ridley's face flushed. "You cannot mean—" "I mean," Sir Thomas interrupted, "that I have lived long enough allowing others to dictate what is proper for me." Lady Ridley stared. "You will ruin yourself." Sir Thomas's mouth tightened. "I am already ruined in their eyes," he said. "I am a crippled recluse who shot his cousin and failed to protect his ward. They whisper regardless. At least let them whisper for something true." Lady Ridley's voice dropped. "What truth?" she demanded. Sir Thomas was very still. "That I intend to marry her," he said. Lady Ridley's breath caught. The room seemed to go silent. "You cannot," she whispered. Sir Thomas's gaze did not waver. "I can," he said, "and I will." Lady Ridley's hands shook slightly. "She is a servant," she said, as if clinging to the word. "She is a gentlewoman," Sir Thomas replied. "Or she was, before society punished her for trusting a man." Lady Ridley's voice sharpened again. "And you will invite that punishment upon yourself?" Sir Thomas's eyes flashed. "I already carry punishment," he said. "Perhaps it is time I carried something else." Lady Ridley stared at him, then turned away, shaken. "You will regret this," she said, though there was less certainty in it now. Sir Thomas's voice softened slightly. "Perhaps," he said. "But for once, the regret will be mine, by choice." Margaret learned of it not from Sir Thomas, but from the sudden shift in the house, the servants' frightened whispers, Mrs. Elwood's rigid silence, Lady Ridley's stormy pacing. That evening, Mrs. Elwood found Margaret in the still room. "He means it," Mrs. Elwood said, voice taut. Margaret looked up, confused. "Means what?" Mrs. Elwood stared at her. "He intends to marry you." Margaret's heart stopped, then began again far too fast. "That is impossible," she said, automatically. Mrs. Elwood's mouth tightened. "Not to him." Margaret's hands went cold. "He cannot," she whispered. "He can," Mrs. Elwood replied, "and if he does, the house will never be quiet again." Margaret felt dizzy. She gripped the edge of the table. This was not what she had wanted. She had wanted safety. A quiet post. A place to be useful and unseen. Not this. Not the centre of another story. Not the risk of destroying the one man who had looked at her and seen something other than stain. Sir Thomas found her later, alone in the corridor outside her room. He stood with his cane, face pale, eyes steady. "Miss Linton," he said quietly. Margaret's voice shook despite her discipline. "Sir Thomas, you must not—" "I will," he said, interrupting gently. Margaret's throat tightened. "You cannot marry me," she said. "You will be mocked. You will be pitied. You will lose what little—" "What little society allows me?" he asked, his voice tightening. Margaret swallowed. "Yes." Sir Thomas's gaze held hers. "And what will you lose?" he asked softly, "by refusing me?" Margaret's breath caught. Everything, she thought. But she could not say it. She forced her voice steady. "I will lose a position," she said. Sir Thomas's expression softened with something like sorrow. "That is not what you mean." Margaret stared at him, the walls of her restraint trembling. "Do you know," she whispered, "what it is to be ruined by a story you did not write?" Sir Thomas's eyes darkened. "Yes," he said simply. Margaret's eyes stung. "Then do not invite another," she said. "Do not let them ruin you because they already ruined me." Sir Thomas stepped closer, one step only, then stopped, as if he feared his own movement. "I am not marrying you to rescue you," he said, voice low. "I am not marrying you to defy them. I am marrying you because you have brought order to my house and something like peace to my mind, because you speak truth when others speak pity, because when you look at me, you do not see a monster or a martyr." Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Sir Thomas's voice softened further. "And because," he said, "I cannot bear the thought of returning to emptiness once I have seen what it is to be understood." Margaret's breath trembled. Understanding was dangerous. It was also irresistible. She lowered her gaze, fighting the old instinct to flee. "Sir Thomas," she whispered, "I am not untouched by this." His expression held stillness, waiting. Margaret lifted her eyes again, and in them was the honesty she usually guarded like a weapon. "I have been punished for less than this," she said, "for a hand held too long, for a conversation overheard, for a man's smile. If you marry me, the whispers will become laughter. They will say you are desperate. They will say you cannot do better. They will say I ensnared you." Sir Thomas's jaw tightened. "Let them," he said. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "And if they dig," she whispered, "they will find every lie told about me and call it truth." Sir Thomas's voice was steady. "Then we will live with truth inside these walls," he said, "and let them choke on their gossip outside them." Margaret stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had once wanted love, in the innocent way young women wanted it, like a promise that would solve everything. Now she understood love was not a solution. It was a risk. It was a choice to stand in the open and be judged. She swallowed, and her voice came out barely audible. "You are asking me," she said, "to be brave again." Sir Thomas's eyes softened. "Yes," he said, "and I am asking myself the same." Margaret's hands trembled. She thought of Bath, of Julian Haraway, of the conservatory, of the way the world had turned her single foolishness into a lifetime sentence. She thought of Sir Thomas's ward, found in the river, punished by shame. She thought of how merciless society was to women. And then she thought of Ridley House, this strange, silent place where two damaged people had found, against all reason, a sort of refuge in one another's presence. She exhaled. And then she curtsied, not as a servant, but as a gentlewoman acknowledging an equal. "Yes," she whispered. Sir Thomas's eyes closed briefly, as though he had been holding his breath for months. When he opened them, his voice was rough. "Then we will do this properly," he said, quietly, without display, but with no apology. Margaret nodded, the weight of it settling into her bones. "Quietly," she echoed. Sir Thomas's mouth tightened with something like fierce tenderness. "And together," he said. They were married in the small parish church on Sir Thomas's estate, with only the necessary witnesses and servants present. Lady Ridley attended, rigid and pale, her pride warring with her conscience. Mrs. Elwood stood as though she would rather face a storm than admit she might be moved. The servants watched with a mixture of astonishment and awe, and fear. Fear, because the world would hear. And it did. The letters arrived within days. Some were polite inquiries laced with venom. Some were outright condemnations, disguised as concern. Some were invitations never intended to be accepted, meant only to remind Sir Thomas of the doors closed to him. But something else happened too, slowly, unexpectedly. The village, which had long viewed Ridley House as a place of ghostly silence, began to see movement. Sir Thomas walking with his wife through the gardens, leaning on his cane but standing straighter. Margaret speaking with tenants' wives, practical and kind. The household becoming gradually less like a mausoleum and more like a living place. Society might whisper, but the estate endured. One evening, months later, Margaret stood in the library window where Sir Thomas had once watched her arrival. Sir Thomas came to stand beside her, careful but steady. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly. Margaret looked out at the fading light over the fields. She thought of everything she had lost. She thought of everything she had risked. And then she thought of the simple truth. She was no longer alone in the story. "No," she said softly. "For the first time I feel not forgiven, but freed." Sir Thomas's hand, careful, not presumptuous, covered hers on the window ledge. "Then we have done something worthwhile," he said. Margaret turned her head slightly and looked at him. "The world will never entirely forget," she said. Sir Thomas's mouth tightened in a faint, wry smile. "Then let it remember," he replied, "that it was wrong." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion she did not allow to become tears. Outside, the house stood quiet, not withdrawn this time, at peace. And within it, two people who had been ruined by stories not their own began, at last, to live as though truth mattered more than gossip. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.